Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
So tonight's conversation is screenwriting, writing for film and television. And I just want to sort of jump in and introduce my esteemed panelists. Starting on my left, Jill Chamberlain is the founding director of the Screenplay Workshop. Her nutshell technique, which you can find over there with the books, for screenplay story structure has been praised throughout Hollywood and is the basis for Jill's book from the University of Texas Press. It's on the syllabus for courses at University of Houston, Notre Dame, and Columbia University. Chamberlain is an award-winning screenwriter and screenwriter for hire whose work has been seen in theaters across the U.S. and on 3 continents. She is on the adjunct faculty of Maryland Institute College of Arts graduate filmmaking program and University of Houston's Jack Valenti School of Communications. Please welcome Jill Chamberlain. Matt Dye attended the University of Texas at Austin and received a Bachelor of Science in Radio, TV, Film with a focus on screenwriting. He's written several short and feature screenplays and wrote and produced a stage play. This is his 10th year working for the Austin Film Festival as screenplay competition director. He facilitates the evaluation of over 9,000 scripts and provides exposure for the year's top writers through special programming at AFF's annual conference. Which if you haven't been to, it's fantastic. You really should check it out. He also oversees the playwriting competition, the scripted portion of the digital series competition, and the coverage program, which provides extensive constructive feedback to writers year-round. Please welcome Matt. Joe Gross writes about movies, books, music, and popular culture for the Austin-American Statesman. He's worked at the American Statesman since 2002 and has contributed to Rolling Stone, Spin, and other publications. He lives in Austin with his family. Please welcome Joe. And Maya Perez is a screenwriter and fiction writer. She is a producer on the Emmy award-winning television series On Story, which just wrapped up its 6th season on PBS, and co-editor of the books On Story, Screenwriters and Their Craft, and On Story 2, Screenwriters and Filmmakers on Their Iconic Films, which are also over there, and signed in advance, signed copies. Perez is a former Michener Fellow, Sundance Screenwriters Intensive Fellow, and New York Stage and Film Emerging Filmmaker. Perez holds a BA from Vassar College and an MFA from the University of Texas at Austin. Her stories have appeared in the Master's Review and Electric Literature. Please welcome Maya. So I thought I would start with like a general question about like the kinds of stories that films and TV tell. The word cinematic is sometimes used for all kinds of stories. Books are cinematic. Comic books can be cinematic. But there really is a difference between like a book and a film. All you have to do is read the book and then like watch a film that comes out that's based on it, and they're quite different. And so I thought I would just sort of begin with that question, like, are there kinds of stories that films, let's say we'll start with films, tell better or can do in a different way than novels can? Are there things that novels or nonfiction or memoir can do that you can't really pull off in film? And of course you think like, the Moby Dick films have not had, like 30-minute discussions of like rope tying and whiteness of whales. But are there other things that happen on the screen that are particular to that genre and don't really happen in the same way on the page?
I mean, this all goes back to Screenwriting 101, that you have to write everything that the audience can see on screen, whereas in novels and fiction, it's all internal. It's all within, not necessarily all internal, but there's much more internal dialogue going on, storytelling going on inside someone's head. But there is a feeling that is evoked when you read that on the page, and you want to evoke that same feeling through visuals. So that's the screenwriter's task in adapting this script, adapting the book into the script, and the filmmakers who are making the film to bring out that emotion. Life of Pi was a book that a lot of people said could not be adapted and made into a film, and we all know it did and won Academy Awards. But you also have a great filmmaker like Ang Lee, who was up to the task, and that's an incredibly visual film. I mean, that's an extreme case of somebody using all of their filmmaking powers to tell a story that essentially a lot of people didn't feel was filmable, but it evoked the same emotions when you're reading the book and as watching the film too.
If people haven't read that book and or seen the film, like how much liberty did Ang Lee take? Is it sort of generally the same story, but just totally recast for film? Or does it feel like the book?
Shamefully, I haven't read the book, but I've read the screenplay. Anybody else here read the book?
So I've read the book, read the screenplay, and saw the movie, and I think that he really does capture it. There's a lot that's condensed, which tends to happen when you have a large book. But it very much looked like what I, as a reader, was imagining or seeing in my mind as I read the book. And I do think that there are some books that, if we're talking about adapting, there are so many writers who believe that the best stories to adapt are more the sort of like what were called like dime store novels and like New York Post type stories, not New York Times stories. But you just really want like just those gritty, great, totally, thoroughly character-driven stories. Whereas something like, and I love her, but I cannot imagine anyone adapting an Alice Munro story for the film,
Kind of a deep dive. That'd be tough.
Yes.
I think literary fiction sort of suffers the most in the attempt to translate it to film. I think there's a reason that, the thriller genre is, has been a root integer of contemporary mainstream cinema for decades now. Something like, the first, excuse me, something like, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code novels. Those are not, I don't think are particularly great movies, but nor do I think they're particularly great books, frankly. But it's funny to see. It's an interesting illustration of how to adapt a book like that to a film, because you watch one of those movies and it's almost entirely exposition. Like literally, it's almost entirely exposition. It's Tom Hanks explaining the weird thing he's looking at, but those films are massively successful. And part of that is that the books are massively successful, and part of it is that Ron Howard is an incredibly gifted director, and there isn't much that guy can't do. I do think that we're in sort of an interesting moment in terms of the length screenwriters can play with in terms of adapting a piece of fiction, in that we're in a moment where film has become, and I really don't hope I get punched in the head by anybody on this panel, that film has become the short form and television has become the long form. And you see something like, what's the HBO thing that was just,
Big Little Lies.
Big Little Lies. I wasn't familiar with the book, but I thought the HBO iteration of it was pretty great. And most of the people I talked to who read the book were really satisfied with how that turned out. And I think screenwriters have a lot more ways to think about an adaptation than they used to.
One book that is sort of at the top of the bestseller charts right now is George Saunders' Lincoln and the Bardo, and it's also been optioned. I can't really imagine what that would look like, because it's almost half of that book is like quotes from writers, talking about Lincoln, and then the other half is often like these like voices in small bits telling stories that are in the past. It's been adapted by, or it's been optioned by Megan Mullally and Nick Offerman. I mean, you would think that they're probably pretty sure they can pull it off. But is that one of those things that like sounds good in theory, and like when in practice you would try to put that on like in a script, it would just like fall apart?
Well, I think it often is disastrous, as we've seen. I mean, I think in broad strokes, and this has kind of been touched on, but I think it's just useful in just the most general sense to think of prose as internal and screenwriting as external. Ultimately, you've got to show it, and not, whether that be image or action. It has to be actionable. We understand characters largely by what they do, and somewhat by what they, to a lesser extent, to what they say. And what they think really doesn't have a place unless you're to use voiceover, which is something of an advanced tool and kind of a crutch for a lot of writers. So I think at the beginning it's helpful, and if you're looking to adapt your own work, can you translate it into something internal to external? That's the place to start thinking about it.
I also want to say, because I cannot imagine Lincoln in the Bardo. I mean, I'll watch Nick Offerman and Megan do anything, so they'll still get my $8, but...
What movie theater are you going to?
1980.
I know, I find my theaters out in Round Rock. But another literary gem that was also optioned that I'm super excited to see is The Underground Railroad. So I'm like, that's just a straight thriller. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's wonderfly well researched. This sort of, I hate the term, but magical realism, and it's so easy to see, and it absolutely has that hook at the end of every single chapter of like, oh my God, what next? That that is why people, why producers continue to adapt thrillers.
Just to pick up on a couple of notes that you all talked about. You talked about exposition, like in the Da Vinci Code movies, and also like condensing things, as in Life of Pi. Those seem to be kind of like at odds with one another. Like you would normally want to condense exposition. How does one do that? What are the tools available to a screenwriter to get stuff as condensed as possible, so that the explanatory stuff that we all have to understand in order to figure out the plot or the story, understand what the characters are doing, is as quick and sort of, painless as possible?
Exposition's a necessary evil, and it's something difficult to answer quickly. I mean, I teach whole classes on that. One tip I'll throw out is I think it's easier, it is more plausible to an audience when somebody needs information than somebody needs to tell information. So if you could find a character who has an active intention and desire that they have to know the information, then the exposition will come as a byproduct. We won't notice as much unless you're a writer or really looking that's what's happening, because the characters actively trying to find something else, and maybe the other character is trying to resist revealing it, and so the exposition comes as a byproduct versus when characters suddenly have to tell us.
So if like the audience wants to know the information as badly as the characters, then we don't mind being like explained to, because we're like, we really want to know this thing.
Yeah, we're in the headset of the person asking. Yeah, I want to know that, right? So we don't even notice that exposition. That really the writer's doing that so they can get some necessary backstory that we need to come out.
I think a film that was also based on a book that really set up exposition well in the film is Silence of the Lambs. In the beginning, you have Clarice Starling as she's running, and already is she running away from something or running towards something? It feels like she's running away from something, and she's just training, doing her FBI trainee stuff, going through the halls. You see what she's up against with like these big men all around her. She's very little. I think there's even a scene in an elevator where she just looks so out of her element. She's passing through. You see like a newspaper clipping that says "Wild Bill on the loose," and those are great ways of explaining what's happening and showing a lot about her character, showing what she's up against. And I feel like you get that very easily visually, and that's all in the book too. And I mean, it's a great adaptation for sure. I mean, it's apparently it was very the first draft of what they essentially shot of the script, adapting it.
Wow.
Apparently, I'm not sure. Does that
Well,
sound about right?
Something else I love about Silence of the... I mean, I love Silence of the Lambs so much, and reading the script and the book and watching the film over and over again. But what they also show, and I thought this was so great for her character, is that she is a rules follower. You know, she's not this sort of like badass Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 or like fighting back against anything. She's a by the book, you know, FBI trainee. And again, you know, as Matt just said, it's like all of this is shown without dialogue. And then there are other ways that movies do it where you can have it be much more obvious, like, I don't know, Mission Impossible, and it's like, we're putting the team together, you know, and then it's like, you have up on the screen, like, this person, and then they tell you, like, these are their stats, this is what they've done, and you're like, oh, and then they're like, you know, but his wife was killed, and blah, 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 so now we know he has baggage. And you just...
It can be rather direct.
Yes, you can be very, very obvious, yeah, or, you know, or you can open a scene or open a film with someone who's filing for divorce, and they have to then answer all of these very personal questions. And I think that I actually feel like that could be, and I'm sure these are all things that Jill covers, just I think it can be a really fun challenge to like figure out, like, how do I get all of this information across? What would be like a totally new way to do this, and to actually also be like either very obvious about it or lay it all out there with no dialogue whatsoever, and just in what I put this character up against.
There's, excuse me. So one of the I think what's generally considered one of the greatest American films is The Godfather. And fortunately, it's also one of the most heavily documented of its process, because Coppola never really gets tired of talking about it, and I wouldn't either if I was he. And there's a book down, if you want to see a director just sort of showing you his brain in almost real time while he's figuring out how to adapt a book into a screenplay, there's a book downstairs, it's kind of expensive, called The Godfather Notebook, that is his copy of, a replica, obviously, of his copy of The Godfather, where he had an assistant take every page of the book and tape it onto into the middle of a piece of, a piece of paper like this. And then he makes notes in the margins on what has to stay, what has to go, what doesn't need to be there. It is a fascinating document, and I was insanely excited when the publisher announced this was coming out, because I've always heard about this thing. I've always wondered about it, and just to see his thought process as it goes along, what needs to stay. There are whole subplots in that book that are just gone and not particularly missed. But at the same time, half of that book is in the second film. So there was a tremendous amount of stuff that had to go, and it's fascinating to see him figure out what had to stay and what was worth keeping. And the punchline of all of this is that, he took a pulpy, salacious, sex-filled, violence-filled book and turned it into a movie that's mostly people standing around talking. And he thought, on the eve of its premiere, I'm doomed. Nobody is going to care about this movie, because the book had been a smash hit, and it was a smash hit because it was a pulpy, salacious book about the mob, and he thought it was going to be a disaster, and we know that it was not. But it's fascinating to see his brain at work figuring that stuff out. If you're looking for a role model for that sort of thing.
You could not aim higher than The Godfather.
No, you really
Pretty
couldn't.
good one.
And it's just fascinating to see it worked out sort of in his head on the page.
Matt, I'm curious. So you organize these competitions, and I wonder if there's a kind of, if year after year, if there are a few things that you take away, in terms of like talking to judges or seeing which entries win, about like basically what to do or what not to do. Are there having too much exposition would be something not to do, or to have people like explaining what's going on instead of showing it would probably be like, don't do that. Are there other like common mistakes that people run into, or other things that really make like a screenplay stand out?
There's a lot that I could talk about in terms of what to do and what not to do. But I think just to sum up, probably the first thing that comes to mind is you want your script to look as professional as possible. Because you're entering your script into our competition, you're going to get a full read. It's not like at an agency or a production company where they could just stop at any time. So you have that luxury of having your work considered fully, but we're still keeping in mind of like what a professional script looks like. And in my mind, that's a script that is just telling the story. It sounds so simple, but a lot of writers try to do the job or anticipate the job of the director, the cinematographer, the editor, the music supervisor, everything. They try to be everything and include it all in the film in the script because they feel like they have to. And then you get distracted reading the script. You don't really know what the story is going on because you have all these ancillary things that are pulling you away from the story. So you want to have concise scene descriptions, dialogue, engaging characters that you want to follow. You want to turn the page. You want to find out what happens next. They say this a lot in screenwriting, but you want to start late, as soon as in the beginning of the story in the script. So
explain just a bit about what that means.
Like exposition, that you reveal a lot of the story peppered out through say like the first act, rather than saying like, this is where we're at right now, this is what's going on. Sometimes you just want to go straight into the action because you want to draw in your audience right away. You want to show what's at stake immediately.
So even though Peter Jackson can spend like 30 minutes like setting up like where the ring is in Lord of the Rings, most people can't really.
Well, he's Peter Jackson.
Right. Like,
so.
Most people can't like pull that off.
There's also a built-in audience for the Lord of the Rings.
I remember talking to Jose Rivera at the film festival last year, the writer for Motorcycle Diaries, and he said that in his first draft of that script, if you've seen Motorcycle Diaries, it begins with a montage of the characters, Che Guevara and his friend getting ready to go off on this motorcycle trip, and it was like 30 minutes long, and the director cut it down to like 4, and he was so offended when he thought he was going to do this, and he saw it, and he's like, well, that was a good move. Is that almost always like a good idea then, is to like get straight to the point as quickly as possible?
I think that's a good rule of thumb for sure. You don't want your reader, we're talking about screenplays here, you don't want them to put it down, because in other places, like, again, agencies and production companies, they have lots of other scripts to read. A lot of agents have their own clients to take care of, or working writers who know exactly how to write a screenplay. And if you're a new writer, you don't want to give them any reason to say no. So make sure your script is formatted properly. I mean, these are all basic things. There's lots of software that you can use, but I'm always surprised how many entries we get in the competition where they're poorly formatted. Some of them, very few, of course, are done on a typewriter. Some handwritten scripts as well.
So
every year.
Let's pick up on this, because I'm sure we have some beginning screenwriters in the room. What are a couple of like programs to use to create a screenplay, to make a screenplay?
Well, the standard is Final Draft, and there's Celtex, which is for free.
I'm going to put in a plug for Writer Duet, which I think is way better than Celtex, which isn't free anymore. I don't think you can get the free version anymore. So I've all my students who still have the old Celtex, I would like, go to Writer Duet. Writer Duet, which is actually made here, the programmer's here in Austin, and it is pretty close to as good as Final Draft, completely free. I think the pro version is better than Final Draft and way cheaper. So writerduet.com.
Okay, so there's a couple of programs. Just some basics in terms of turning in like a screenplay that looks like a professional screenplay. For a feature-length film, like some nuts and bolts stuff. How many pages on average
Shorter the better. I mean, it's always said it's like 90 to 120 pages, but you want to get to the shorter side as much as possible. Like comedies tend to be shorter, around 90 pages or less.
Same for horror. Horror tends to be about like
Horror
90
thrillers.
pages.
Dramas, historical dramas tend to be longer, but I think I speak for a lot of professional readers when they come across like a historical drama and you look at how long it is. Even though it's really good, it's really long. A lot of them are usually 120 plus pages, even though in our competition we recommend that it be under 120, but we'll still read it.
So you're talking like basically like a minute a page. Is that a kind of
Roughly, yeah. It also depends. If it's dialogue heavy, and sometimes that might fill up the page a lot, but it depends on how fast they talk.
What about in terms of like number of like scenes or sort of acts, or like how else are like screenplays sort of divvied up into like, you know, pieces?
Well, I think Jill can talk a lot about her nutshelling method.
Well, so structurally, feature-length scripts are 3 acts typically. Some writers kind of parse that into, or I've seen some books that parse it into other amounts, but I think they are taking those same 3 acts and breaking it down. And you know, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, in the simplest form, we're talking about a beginning, middle, and an end. I do think most screenplays, though, are the structure is surprise. I think, particularly if you're new to screenwriting, you will be surprised at how much more structured it is. That Act 1 is typically 30 pages. Act 2 is typically twice as long, 60 pages. Act 3 is 30 pages, and there are specific things that tend to happen in those acts. There's a certain amount of universal agreement upon. I think a lot of people, when they first come to it, it seems a lot more, and this is a term I hate, formulaic than people are. And I don't know anything much about novel writing, and there may be people who have formulas for that. But my impression is that it is not nearly. There aren't as many clear structures that people follow. While 3-act story structure following that was just in the basic sense that I mentioned is pretty close to universal. I don't know if you guys find that differently.
When you're starting off, I agree. Yeah, you kind of want to follow the rules before you break them.
How does one follow those rules? So if there are like, and there are many screenwriting books where you can like learn like the beats, right? Is what you're talking about, like sort of like beats that happen within.
Actually, a little different.
Okay, please.
I'm actually kind of opposed to the beat methods.
I'm one of those novelists who don't know what they're
Okay.
talking about. Yeah.
So some books get a lot of approaches are a beats approach, where they're getting far more specific than 3 acts, where we're going to talk 15 specific beats that are supposed to happen in your screenplay, or 22, depending on, and I've seen up to 120, depending on the author of the beats method. I find that those methods can be used, but there's a danger that it doesn't address some story structure things that I think a more dynamic structure fits. So I don't teach a beats method. I present it as an option, but more important is a dynamic structure that I present. So, and I'll just sort of quickly sum it up that everybody thinks they've got a great idea for a story, right? Most people don't. What they have is what I would call as a situation. And life is a situation. Life is this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. That's not a story. Story is this happens, which leads to that happening, which then makes it ironic when this happens. There's an internal dynamic thing between the parts. And almost all the beats methods you'll see out there don't address that. They just tell you it's these 15 beats. They don't talk about a relationship between the parts. So I prefer an approach that has far less structure, but it's a dynamic structure. There's a relationship between the parts, and there's a cause and effect. And that's the danger and sort of the glut I see of a lot of and a lot of people I counsel with screenplays in using the beats approach, is that they end up with a situation, not a story.
Maya, you're nodding. Like when you're working on a screenplay, like, do you think about beats and structures? I mean, do you have that sort of in the back of your mind, or are you just, or do you think like story first and then these things tend to emerge?
I'll briefly just share like my method, which is one, and I also write, as I said, like short fiction and novels. So I'm always trying to think about like, I'll have a story that I think about, and I'm trying to think like which format will this work best in. And if it's a screenplay, as Jill just said, so often it's like you have to differentiate between sort of like a concept and like in what will really have legs, you know, and for a story, and will there be as much energy when I am like in the middle of my second act or, you know, toward the end of it, or will I have like lost just a ton of steam by that point? So a method is generally to write a brief logline, and this isn't like to sell it, but it's just like me writing down like this is what my story's about. And then from there, I'll usually write like a really short little sort of proposal of like this will be sort of like roughly my first act, second act, third act. And then from there, I'll do a treatment. And this is all in Word. And then once I have that with like my slug lines and like, oh, and then this will happen and she'll walk in, then I'll copy and paste that into Fade In, and I have like 17 pages already of the script, which is amazing. And I have to have that structure, but it is not so much a matter of I have to have this many scenes for Act 1 or Act 2. And I think, for me at least, that can just be a little too debilitating at first, because I feel like the first draft that you write has to truly just be like your love and passion for the story, and like it has to come out onto the page. And your second draft, you can write another outline, and that's the one maybe where I'll start to think more structurally. Okay, it's dragging here, I need more here. But people can always tell, you know, and I've read for AFF and for lots of other competitions, and there are some screenplays that are really so tightly structured, and they're just not very interesting. Like someone's like really got like the hang of this, but like where's the voice? And like, were you ever like tearing up when you were thinking about the story, or did you ever laugh when you were writing this? And I could almost rather read a script that is a little rougher around the edges, but that's a really original voice and that really has like that emotion.
What do you mean by that in terms of voice? You know, as somebody who writes like prose, I can wrap my head around that. But in terms of like a screenplay, how does voice work? Is it like a central character's voice, or is it a kind of like sort of attitude in general?
Well, I think of it as one, sort of the stories that certain people are drawn to. Like, it's interesting to me that Bill Broyles is always writing about war and specifically coming home from war. And this is whether he's writing Castaway or China Beach. And so I think that's part of voice. I also think part of it is you can see it on the page. Like, you know, Shane Black has this style that is very irreverent, and for anyone who doesn't know, he wrote Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and The Nice Guys and
Lethal
Weapon and Iron Man 3. And his scripts absolutely read like that sort of like rat-a-tat-tat dialogue style. He has these little asides to the reader all the time. And then there are others that are just much, like David Guggenheim, who wrote Black Box and Safe House and some others that they read starkly. And you can, they read like they look in the movies. And that's almost all of his scripts. They have that's what they read like. So that's sort of how I define it. It's almost like what the stories that you're drawn to, even if they're all they can look on the outside very different. It's almost like if you find yourself like you keep dating the same person, even though at first they always seem like they're totally different, and they're like, nope, they're all the same. I feel like that's sort of like the movies. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think voice could also be, it is a part of style, but it's also about perspective too. That when you're reading this, you feel that the writer lived this and that they did their research, and it just feels so real, and that only this writer can tell this story. Sounds like such a broad thing to say, but you want your reader to feel that way when they're done reading the script, that I want to meet this person and see if this is something that they lived. So that's how I would define it. And like Maya said about style, like Shane Black does do that in his scripts. So there are a lot of people who, well, like take Aaron Sorkin, for example. A lot of people consider him a writing god, TV writing god, screenwriting god. He writes very distinctive dialogue. He's known for doing the walk and talk in his shows, like on The West Wing, things like that. Things that a writer will tend to put into several of their own screenplays, like a theme that like, oh, they're putting that in there again, and can't think of any examples, but things like that. So yeah, that's how I'd probably define voice.
Joe, I want to turn this question to you in kind of a different way. Matt and Maya were talking about, like, when you read lots and lots of screenplays, certain things tend to jump out, like voice, and also like other things that are not so great, like feeling very well structured but not really having any kind of life to it. And I wonder, because you review films for The Statesman, so you see like a lot of films. When you see certain stories over and over, like heist films, you mentioned like Mission Impossible, which are always going to have certain kind of like things happen in heist films. What makes a film stand out to you, like just as a reviewer, or as a fan, somebody thinking about, do I like this or not? Does it have anything to do with structure? Or does it have to do with voice? What are the things that tend to like sort of make you lean forward and think, I'm tired, but I'm really into this film right now?
I think one thing that, this is on, excuse me, on a very high level of quality, is the extent to which you see something that you think this could only, what everyone here has been saying throughout the evening, something that can only be told, a story that can only be told in film. And the extent to which I'm seeing a story that I haven't necessarily seen before. And I think one of the reasons that Moonlight resonated with so many people last year is this was a story that people had not seen before. And it was very specific, and this is going to sound horribly cliched and unfortunate, but something that you said, that Matt said that triggered something, is that specificity can be universality. I know that's a terrible, unfortunate way to say it, but there was a very specific experience in Moonlight that resonated with a lot of people, and for that didn't necessarily have anything to do with this character, but moved a lot of people and resonated with a lot of people. And so when I see something that I think this couldn't have been told any better in any other medium, and this is a story I'm not necessarily seeing before, and there are very specific things about it, that always helps. And Moonlight is in many ways a very small film. It's there are no special effects. There's nothing. It's folks standing around talking and occasionally yelling, and it's extraordinary. So that goes a long way with me.
And I just recently saw that film, and it's a particular place and time, but there are moments, there's a bullying scene, which I think probably anybody who's ever been a kid can identify with that. There's an awkward scene of sort of hesitant reaching out in terms of like, you like somebody, do they like me? Those are universal things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about structure in that film? That's a film that takes place, as I recall, in 3 different time periods. He's younger, then he's a little older, and then he's quite a bit older. Is that just like sort of 3-act structure broken up in terms of like time periods, or is that just like a sort of a one-off thing that director and writer pulled off that you can't replicate in another film?
Well, I think what I recall hearing about the original source material, that it was an unproduced play, that it was those 3 storylines converging all together at the same time. So to streamline it, they broke it up into 3 chapters, which made a lot of sense. But in the world of theater, that probably you could pull that off because of the suspension of disbelief that happens on stage. But I don't know how they could have structured it that way. So in terms of adapting something differently and doing better, I think because it's the medium of film and visual that was needed. So,
is that something that is kind of just naturally inherent to film, is linear forward movement? And how can you move back and forth, Joe?
Oh, well, something that something Richard Linklater is very fond of saying over and over and over again is that film is a medium of time, and it has a unique relationship with time. And I think that's absolutely true. I think there are other media that use time in a very interesting way, and can use time in a really interesting way. But I think film is absolutely able to, jump forwards and backwards in ways that can aid your narrative. I mean, that can get extremely complicated at the screenwriting stage, I would think. But I think film can do that in extraordinary ways.
Yeah, I think nonlinear stories are completely valid. And filmmaker Godard said, somewhat pretentiously, but I will agree with him, yes, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, just not necessarily in that order. We still need all 3, though, for it to be a story. Otherwise, and by the way, not every movie tells a story. Actually, Slacker famously doesn't tell a story. As you're saying, film is an excellent medium for shifting back and forward in time, and nonlinear is absolutely a way that you can present a story, and sometimes to better effect. A lot of stories wouldn't work actually if you redid the structure of Pulp Fiction in the linear order. It wouldn't really work as well.
That's a great example. Let's switch gears just a little bit away from like the craft of screenwriting to like the process of how like a screenplay becomes a film. What happens? So in books, one gets an agent. The agent sells the book to a publisher. It goes through revisions, and then it hits the bookshelf. Is there kind of like parallel process for screenplays and films, or is it just utterly and completely different?
I think the first step is the same. You really are going to need an agent or manager if you are going to sell something, unless you want to make it independently. And there are, and I guess maybe the parallel there would be self-publishing in some ways. But yeah, first step is kind of the same.
well, if there's a writer's strike, there's no movies going to be made for a while. But like Jill said, you need an agent or manager, and a lot of agents and managers will only take a meeting with you or consider you if you've proven yourself in some kind of way, which is why screenplay competitions and fellowship programs and labs are still so relevant and so important, because these competitions, ours in particular, receive thousands of scripts, and if you get a seal of approval from our readers and our industry judges, like we're already doing the legwork for them and giving our seal of approval. They'll take the meetings because they have stacks of scripts in their office and other tons of emails in their inbox from people saying you should meet with this writer. But if this person has won AFF out of 9,000 scripts or won the Nickel Fellowship out of 7,000, then this is a writer who we need to get in touch with for sure. So that's one way. That's a starting point. But you definitely need an agent or manager. There's definitely some people who've made it without, but if you're completely unconnected from the industry, you kind of need an agent or manager.
And let me just add the added burden that we live in Austin. It's not impossible to, and you know, Hollywood's where they make movies. It's not impossible to do it from here, but you got to have someone there to represent you. And you're probably going to have to move there. There are some successful screenwriters who live here, but most of them establish themselves in Hollywood first, and then they can come back here and live the good life, and you know, fly out for a meeting when they have to, or Skype. But it's going to be you're going to have a huge disadvantage that you need to keep in mind if you're living here. So something like a competition, which is a way to get you on the radar of agents and managers, who are pretty exclusively in LA, and some are in New York, but almost all are in LA. You're going to have someone out there who is representing you, literally.
And often scripts what makes or break a script is the talent that's attached to it. If you can get an actor, a big name actor who read the script, loved it, and wants to make it, then you'll get on the fast track to get it made. But then also you're sort of beholden to that person and what they want to do with the script too. So that's a whole nother discussion once you get to that point of potentially making it.
I think there's something else to think about when you're writing, obviously, is writing characters that actors will just be drooling to play, because that's pretty much the only way it's going to get made. I think it really has to be, this will make them a star, and this will test them, and they've never played anything like this before, and just anything you can do to make your characters as complex and rich as possible.
Are there any examples you can think of like really great characters from film? It seems natural, like, boy, I bet everybody was really wanting to like have that part.
August Osage County.
Meryl Streep's character.
I feel like every character, and you know, I mean, that's also Tracy Letts. So,
right.
But I mean, you know, we all see them and we just think like, oh my God, that's amazing, and you do think of it as sort of like Oscar bait, but they are, you know, that's Talented Mr. Ripley. That was absolutely one.
The girl with the dragon tattoo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then, you know, switch gears yet again. We haven't really talked about television. And Joe, I want to come to you for this one, because you mentioned earlier that films are sort of the short form and television has now become the long form. And there's lots of like innovative stuff happening with television. You know, HBO and you know, Amazon and Netflix are all sort of like doing these long series, or doing either like, you know, multiple series shows, or just like a kind of like extended miniseries. And I wonder what you've noticed, like about what makes certain television shows able to sort of fill that amount of time. Like I mean, if you put like, I mean, the number of hours compared to a film is much, much, much longer. How did they fill it? What's going on?
Sometimes not well. I think we're sort of at an interesting point with that as well, when a couple of years ago, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, I heard that one of the reasons that so many sort of, you know, new golden age of television shows had a 13-episode season was that was the most economical way to package them for DVD sales. And so that became sort of the standard. And it's also, you know, a quarter of a year. I mean, 13 weeks is and, you know, half of a sort of regular
You
TV
can hear the
season.
brains whirring doing the calculations.
Yeah.
Is it?
But increasingly, I think you're running into shows that don't need to be sort of prestige shows that aren't beholden to network ideas of how many stories need to be in a season, that are actually sort of erring a little on the long side. And there's a program on FX that just wrapped up called Legion that was a brilliant show and was based on a comic book character, but very wisely sort of chucked everything except the name and a couple of reference points and made this very strange, very psychedelic show about sort of mental illness mostly. And that was from Noah Hawley, who is here on and off, I would assume. But that show is stunning. And very wisely, it's 8 episodes long. The first season was 8 episodes, and that's it. And I think it wouldn't surprise me if he looked at other adaptations of superhero fiction that were feeling a little padded, like Netflix's Daredevil show, the Luke Cage show, the Jessica Jones show. All of those have, their strengths and weaknesses, but I think all of them could have been, 2 episodes shorter and would have done, and everything just would have felt much tighter. So it sounds, I think there's a lot of planning that goes into something like that, and figuring out how you're going to tell this story. And sometimes you can sort of feel the filmmakers get to episode 7 and suddenly realize, well, crap, we got to do 4 more of these, and we're sort of out of story. And that can't be a great feeling for anyone.
Well, I think also it's like we're in this binge watching culture that's also very fickle too, and that constantly oversaturated with material in TV and the media. But I think what's the strongest form of marketing is word of mouth. Like Stranger Things was huge last year. I don't remember seeing it in my queue for Netflix, and all my friends were telling me to watch it, and it took me maybe like 5 or 6 months to get on the bandwagon and watch it. But I think you want to create content for television that is buzzworthy, that will make people want to talk about it, because everybody wants to be the first one to discover something and then tell everybody about it. So that's why you sometimes have things like Game of Thrones, where they kill off a main character every episode, and there's always like this crazy cliffhanger and twist thing. And you talk about Legion, which I also love too. Like every episode is just so bonkers. Yeah. And then you watch the next episode and it just almost refutes what happened in the last episode, and you don't know what to trust anymore. And like, should I just give up on this? And then they do something else in the episode and you're like, oh, now I love this. So it's that you want to inspire that strong word of mouth. And I mean, it's easier said than done, but that's where we are with TV, I think.
I want to sort of close on one more craft question that's related to things you've all just said, and then I'm going to turn over to some questions from the audience. And it's about filling space. In like prose workshops, one of the things that they tell you to avoid is like set pieces, like long pieces that sort of like fill up a majority of, like, say, a short story. They say, watch out for those because they tend not to work. Like, if you need multiple acts, you don't have that. It's just like one. Like, especially in TV and in film too, you'll often see like scenes that last much longer than you would expect. And in like, you're smiling, maybe you know where I'm going with this, because I know you're a fan of the show Atlanta. In Atlanta, there's this amazing episode that takes place almost entirely in jail. Like, they're waiting and like sort of to get booked, I think. And I bet there's probably 3 acts in this one scene, because it just goes on and on and on and on. And it's almost the entire episode. And so I wonder, whether it's in TV or in film, how do you fill a scene, no matter how long it is, to make it feel rich and not just like, like one thing after another. Like, person shows up, crazy thing happens, next thing happens. Like, how do you fill it so it's rich with character and voice and whatever?
One quick thing I'll throw out is you often hear you want to start a scene, and you were talking about starting the story as late as, or starting the script as late as possible. You want to start a scene as late as possible, and you want to leave it as soon as you can. I'll throw out that platitude, but it's a helpful platitude. And obviously, not every scene can you jump to the heart of the conflict and jump out. But it is a good rule of thumb to start with, I think. And then, the pacing is a little more subtle than that when you're putting something together. Where, like I said, every scene we can't jump right to the heart of the conflict, and you need to. Okay, well, this scene is going to have a slower build, and I need the characters to enter and one at a time, and or the scene I do want to show the aftermath after the conflict of and the one character's left the room and the other character is there, but it's a good thing to start with.
I like that idea. So like sometimes a thing can happen and you think, okay, that's the end of the scene, but then if you keep filming, it's like, or keep writing, it's what happens next. Okay.
Well, and there's also, I mean, Atlanta's, it's the difference also, I think, between like a character-driven story and an action-driven story. And no one's watching Atlanta to see, like, are they going to sell Paperboy CDs? Right. Like, that's not... like, we're watching for Donald Glover and for, like, all of these incredible characters and their dynamics together. And it's, in that jail scene, like, that's the sort of scene that it's like, you could have had this in a diner, but the fact that you put it in jail... and that these are black guys, and that they're running, and then they're like running into like someone who's like, wait, didn't we go to high school with you? And weren't you a dude then? Like they're just like all these like wonderful little moments, and that it does make that scene so rich, and so much does happen in it. But like you couldn't put that scene in. I don't know, Mission Impossible, for example. It just wouldn't work. Because like that you are watching, because it's like, what's next? It's like I'm watching for the adrenaline, and Atlanta is definitely not.
Right.
But to go on crafts, because I'm in the middle of rewriting a script right now, and I was going through through my notes from when I did this Sundance Lab thing. And I wanted to share it with everyone here. This was they bring in this woman, Joan Tewksbury, who's just an incredible sort of character whisperer. And I don't know if you all have this problem when you're writing, but sometimes I just sort of get so stuck in it, and it's like, well, how would your character react? Like, have them react organically, like really, like what would they do? And I sometimes feel like I don't even know how I would react anymore. Like I feel like I've lost my sense of myself, and so I definitely don't know how this made-up character is going to. And she had us do these exercises, and what you're really doing then is pulling on past experience. And she would just ask these questions, and as Joe was saying, always be as absolutely specific as you can be, and the more specific you are, the more universal it becomes. And just some of these questions were, for example, what are the physical signs that you have shown of being in love? And like write down 3 or 4 of those. What are 3 or 4 times that you didn't tell someone something? What are times that you have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that you've tried to convince someone a situation was bad, that you pulled away to save yourself? And it was just such a great exercise for us to write down all these things, because these had already happened, so you could remember what the reaction and what the response was, like that you had, that the people around you had. And you can absolutely steal those things for your characters, because most of our characters are always going to sort of be these amalgamations anyway, largely pulled from our own selves. And I don't know, I was just going through that, and I wanted to share it because I've just found it so helpful whenever I'm trying to like just really sink my teeth into a character and what is a real response. It's like, it makes me insane when, like, you'll have like and usually it's like the woman character who finds out that the man character was lying and he's actually filthy rich, and now she's mad at him. And I'm like, okay, who's mad at someone for being rich? Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, why are we doing this? And it's just how to have not a story reaction, or to have people doing things just because it's going to like move your plot, get you over into your second act, but will really engage people, and they're following because they are dying to know what is going to happen to this character.
That seems like a good note to move to the audience on.
This is for everybody on the panel, I guess, whoever. What advice would you give an 11-year-old who is just starting work on her first screenplay? And are there any screenwriting competitions for children 11, or are there any agents that would look at an 11-year-old's work? Any advice on that?
Okay, well, I'll just start that one because I'm also the mother of an 11-year-old. And I, when I was in grad school and watching and rewatching certain movies, and she'd want to watch them with me. This was several years ago, so she was much younger. And I would let her, but with the stipulation that, she would know I'm going to stop this film several times throughout. And even if it's like The Searchers, like start it, stop it 10 minutes in or 5 minutes in, what do we already know? What do we know about these people? And she'd have to write that down, or she'd have to write down, we're watching Frozen, like what has happened? And how would you write that, what's happened on the screen? And there are all of these screenplays, to all of your child's favorite films. Like, I'm guessing that at least 98% of them are available online for free. And I really think, believe me, I want everyone to buy On Story and Jill's books. But the very best thing you can ever read is screenplays. And so I just think the more you can read them and then read them and watch side by side, that would be the best advice, I think, for writing them. And an agent will represent any script that they think that they can sell. So you're fine there. And there are lots of competitions for kids, Matt.
Well, there's no age restriction in entering the screenplay competition. I think we've had 1 or 2 high schoolers each year who advance in the competition. I can't say we've had an 11-year-old, but I do need to make a plug for the Austin Film Festival because we do have a summer film camp that we're still accepting. If you'd like to have your kid sign up for a class this summer, we have claymation, we have filmmaking, screenwriting. It covers all the different things. So whatever she's interested in, we probably have it covered.
One final question for our panelists before we go. What are you working on now? What should we be looking for? What should we be looking for from your work?
Well, we're getting thousands of screenplays right now, so I'm hoping that a lot of the writers who submit their work will be seeing that on the big screen, in TV as well. I've worked with many writers over my 10 years at AFF, and I'm always excited when something actually makes it, or they make it and they're working on a TV show. It's fun to see their names pop up on a TV show as a staff writer and stuff like that. So one of the scripts that won 3 awards actually last year got optioned by Max Bornstein's company. He's the guy who wrote the screenplay for Kong, Skull Island, and Godzilla, and we're really hoping that one's on the fast track to get made. So that's what I'm excited about seeing. I'm not working on anything right now, but hopefully I will in the future. Yeah.
Not with 9,000 scripts to get out there.
When I discovered about 10 years ago that I'm really good at fixing other people's screenplays, and they pay me, and I tell them this is wrong or change this to this, and they say, thank you, that's a great idea. I found that really satisfying. And so I no longer do original screenplays. Occasionally I'll do something for hire, but generally I'm a script consultant. My job is to fix other people's screenplays. And then I always have ongoing workshops, the screenplayworkshop.org. I do group classes all year round.
I am, as Michael said before, I'm a producer on the TV show On Story, and it just premiered season 7 last Saturday. It airs on KLRU. So I'm frantically putting together the rest of season 7 episodes right now, and then I will get back to this screenplay.
I write for the Statesman on a more or less daily basis. And other than that, at the moment, the only thing I'm working on is I'm futzing around with the second draft of one of those, those 33 1/3 books. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? They're a series of books about one album, and I'm working on draft 2 of a book about a record called In on the Kill Taker by Fugazi. And the pub date got moved rather radically because I think the publisher accepted more than they could publish in a certain amount of time, and they just bumped a bunch of them, which is both good and bad because it gives me more time to futz around with it, and it's bad because it gives me more time to futz around with it.
Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.